I'm Sarah Hodges, and this is Executives Uncut, the podcast where we provide solutions for the corporate cycle of hell. And today we're talking about mind reading and storytelling. And I'm here again with Fergus Connolly, performance coach, author, and TED Talk speaker, all around very cool guy with a really neat Irish accent as part of our Concepts of Chaos series. Hey, Fergus.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you very
How's it,
much.
how's it
Thank you very
going?
much for the wonderful intro.
You're welcome. I try to change it up a little bit every time for you. Mostly I mess it up, but it's cool. So let's talk about mind reading and storytelling. This shows up so much in coaching. This is all about the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves and others. Um, where has this popped up for you with yourself or with coaching?
Uh, I think you see it a lot with athletes and actually with coaches as well. That's where I first came across it, where they start to tell themselves, convince themselves of things. But I actually remember a story. It was about this. There's a guy actually in Eastern Washington University. He had gotten in trouble for underage drinking and whatever. So the judge, rather than put him in jail for a long period, he told him every weekend he had to turn up, and he was put in the cell over the weekend. And one particular weekend he had a cellmate, some guy who'd jumped bail, and the young kid's jumping up, looking out through the rail, looking through the bars, and his older cellmate says to him, he said, "Hey, what's the view like?" And he replied, "Oh, it's just a muddy parking lot." And the older cellmate was leaning back, looking out through the window, and he said, "Well, I see stars." And this young guy, Jimmy, he said it made him think about, the stories that we tell ourselves. Like, depending on what you look at, you can see either a muddy parking lot or stars in the sky. And that young Jimmy went on to become the Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis. And he points
Wow.
that story out as way back in 1968 as being very, very important about like what you tell yourself and what you look at. And you can look at the same thing, see two completely different things. And so it's really, really important what kind of stories and perspectives that you want to choose to tell yourself.
Fergus, that story's freaking awesome. We should just finish the podcast right there. That
Mic,
is like a mic
mic drop.
dropper, right? That's so awesome. That's so that's really cool. And yeah, like that's a perfect example because so much of it is about perspective and the stories we tell ourselves, but so many of these stories we're just replaying in our head over and over again, or we tell ourselves a story to help ourselves feel more comfortable in an environment that we don't understand, or we use it to predict behavior to feel more socially safe, right? And sometimes, very infrequently, telling yourself a story can be helpful because that false sense of control or understanding in difficult situations can soothe acute stress, right? If you have like an acute stress, you can give yourself a sense of like, okay, well, I understand the environment that I'm in, so I feel safe. But normally it's false. Normally it prevents you from being able to fully empathize with others or become compassionate with yourself, right? Like what else have you seen it do in organizations or in sport?
Well, I think we often tell stories or tell ourselves stories to simplify so we can understand things that are incredibly complex. And like we tell ourselves a story, oh well, for example, I this proposal failed because they don't like me, rather than like really delving into the complexity and trying to figure out and solve the problem. That's
Mhm.
just, and sometimes it's about making an excuse. We tell a story that simplifies us, and then we can either, blame somebody, or we can sometimes blame ourselves. There's a really, really famous, I'm going to tell another story, but there's a really famous story about um, Michael Jordan. I think the Bulls were playing, I forget who they were playing, but after this game where they lost, Jordan was asked about the performance, and he said, well, he had been insulted by one of the opposition players, and of course they play 3 days later, and Jordan, scores a whole load of points, and they interviewed this guy who apparently insulted Jordan in the first game. He said, I didn't say a word to him at all. He said, I never spoke to him. But Michael Jordan made up this story both to motivate himself, to motivate others, and so we can create stories, tell ourselves stories to either simplify things, or we can use them sometimes to motivate ourselves. But we have to be careful because sometimes that can be, to our detriment as well.
Yeah, I mean that's a really interesting because typically I see, mind reading and storytelling in organizations is, honestly adding a toxicity to a culture. It encourages passive aggression, it causes needless worry and
Mm,
anxiety, and it really prevents you from being able to I think that we get into these relationship cycles, right? Where you have a certain expectation from someone, because you've seen that behavior before. So you have a bias toward how they're going to act. And so you expect it. And then you kind of go looking for that behavior to repeat itself. And then when it repeats itself, you use it to confirm your bias, right? Confirmation bias. To say, oh yeah, they are that way. And that prohibits you from being able to see that person and acknowledge them when they show up in a different way and reinforce that behavior that you would like to see from your staff, let's say, as a leader. And so also another positive story, but from a different take than from a different perspective than the Michael Jordan story. I had a client very recently. And I may have told this story on the podcast before because it's one of my favorites, but she noticed that her boss just kind of wasn't showing up for meetings. He just was never, like, they would have a meeting scheduled, he would never show up for them, and at a certain point she would just kind of laugh whenever she saw the meeting on the schedule because she's like, he's not going to show up. And she was telling her the story, the story in her mind, that he's not showing up because he doesn't care. He doesn't care about me. He doesn't value me. He doesn't value the work that I do. He doesn't value our time together. Um, well, a couple months later, she got a huge promotion, and I mean a huge promotion. Like, she's basically running the company now. And the reality is that he didn't show up for their meetings because he just trusted her. He had absolute, complete trust in her. And so he didn't feel like he needed to check in on her. Now, granted, he could have communicated that with her, but regardless, she was telling herself a story that made her feel really, really anxious at work, and it was the polar opposite of what he was thinking. So, you know, that when it comes down to it, how you can prevent yourself from mind reading and storytelling is don't guess, like encourage open dialogue. She actually reached out to him and said, "Hey, I imagine that you are curious about what's happening in my department. Can we jump on our call this week and I can update you?" Right? So she made it happen. She had the conversation with him and then had the opportunity to tell him how well she was doing. What are some other good solutions or other good tips to prevent this sort of thing from happening?
I think simply taking time and having awareness of the situation. I think sometimes, you create stories and tell yourself stories when you're under most stress or pressure most often. And sometimes taking a step back is the most important thing to do. And like you said earlier, one of the downsides is that if you create very usually simple stories, you don't view people truly as they are, which is complex, multifaceted, able to change and that. So, sometimes our stories are very, very simple and sometimes they're very, very wrong as well. So taking a
Mm-hmm.
step back and just recognizing that there are lots of different possibilities,
Mm-hmm.
and not being sometimes our stories when we're under pressure are far, far too negative, and then they become self-fulfilling. And so, yeah, taking some
Mm-hmm.
time, reflecting. One of the other really useful things is actually having a coach as well. I have found that very helpful because you get that opportunity to talk things through, and somebody can help provide better perspective for you that you might not want to or might not be aware of, but you need to hear that. And
Mm-hmm.
I had somebody recently they were in a challenging situation, and just being able to present all of the other perspectives that they were just not able to or willing to look at that moment in time was particularly helpful for them, just in relieving stress and pressure.
Yeah, and I think sometimes before, like, listen, if you're telling yourself a story and you're really angry, right? Like, well, they're behaving this way because they think that. Whenever you say to yourself, they think blank or they're just doing it because blank, you're mind reading, and that's a time to step back. But sometimes before you start to look at other perspectives, it's really important to make some space to just be freaking angry, right? To just be disappointed or upset. And then remember that that person is a human being, that you may be telling yourself a story, right? And then you can look at it from other perspectives. But if you're holding on to the anger while you're looking at it from other perspectives, all those other perspectives are going to be colored by the same bias, right? You're going to look at them through the same lens of anger and continue to come up with the same types of explanations for their behavior.
Yeah, I often tell people, like, I mean, if I asked you what your childhood was like on a day that you're really happy, like what the weather was like when you were growing up, on a day that you're really happy or on a day that you're really sad, you'd probably tell me on the day that you're really happy that it was always sunshine, and on the day that you're sad it was always raining. So it's just, recognize how your mood is going to influence how you think about things.
Yeah,
It's
well, and not just mood, but I mean, there are a lot of, I mean, I guess you could say subconscious until we bring our awareness to them. Stories that we tell ourselves repeatedly over and 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 over again, that where we're trying to understand ourselves, right? I am this way. I believe these things. These are my values, or just, we're unconsciously showing up in the world that way. But most of us have an inner monologue that is pretty nasty, like to many degrees, and over time that can really deflate your confidence. So it's not just, being aware of how you're explaining other people's behavior, but being aware of how you are labeling yourself too, and see if you can be more compassionate with yourself, which is actually going to help reduce your stress and motivate you more, and then if you can be more empathetic with others.
yeah, and simply, yeah, no, absolutely, and
Just taking
simply
that
just
in.
no, but also just simply realizing you don't have to make judgments all the time. You can just, things are, just recognize that you don't always have to have all of the answers either and all of the explanations, and just taking that time is really, really important. And particularly, it's a little bit better today, ironically, because of the virus and everything that's happening. But when people are rushing from job to meeting to job to meeting to phone call, they don't get that time, or don't take that time often to have that awareness.
That's that's so true. I personally fall into that trap a lot of like, well, I have to fix everything, right? I have to make everything better. I have to be aware of everything that's going on and then constantly be adjusting and optimizing it. And to be honest, today I showed up at the office and I just sat in my car for like 3 to 5 minutes and I just sat there. And I was like, I really need this. I need to just sit here. And it wasn't about thinking, it wasn't about meditating, it wasn't about anything, but just giving my brain a break, just staring at nothingness in the parking lot. So sometimes give yourself that little bit of a break, and your brain will do a lot of work for you, recover and soothe itself. It's a great point, Fergus.
Take time.
Take time, slow down,
It's the only
and be
thing you
really
can't
present.
buy. You can't buy time.
Yeah, that's so true. So, I think a couple of other things in now that we're talking about time, I feel like we should slow down this podcast. Like it's changing my energy a little bit. Isn't that funny? You kind of have that effect on me though, which is weird.
It's just the accent.
It's just the accent. But um, something that you brought up in our meetings about this podcast earlier was really addressing things right away. Instead of mind reading, like have an open dialogue and an open conversation. But how can people do that when they're angry, right? Or they're already making assumptions? How can they, like, what's the strategy they can use to put that aside to approach that conversation, fresh and so it's not accusatory?
Yeah, I think a lot of the time it's just about actually having the conversation. You see, one of the things that we do is we take our time actually, I need to talk to them. Should I? Well, is our officer? I need to organize a meeting. When sometimes you're as well just get up, walk in, close the door, and just have a chat and be open and honest about it. Because again, a lot of the time that we spend thinking, talking, talking to ourselves and worrying, we run through all of these different possibilities, and none of them could be true. You just don't know. So you're as well, or it's better to just go and have a conversation and not build it up and create so much expectation or fear. So just go and have the conversation. And if you can do it at work, that's fine. If you can do it away from work, that's fine. Sometimes the less stressful the environment, but just actually having the conversation and being open, I think, is most important. And you very often find that that just becomes the platform to build closer relationships with with
Yeah.
people who you work with.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, instead of going and having the conversation, they, send texts or emails, right? They're like, "Here's all of my thoughts from our from this. This is my email. I'm airing all my grievances," right? And they're getting it all in writing, and I think that's a great idea to let the other person think about it. Um, and on occasion that can work. I've noticed that pours more fuel on the fire than anything. And I love what you're saying of just go in and walk in that door, but for the times when you can't, for the times when you're still so charged up,
Mm.
you know, the ultimate objective when you walk in that door is to make sure that you feel safe and secure and calm, and that person feels safe and secure and calm. And that is the only way that you're going to have a productive conversation. If there has been something, if there is something that happened that has been disruptive to you emotionally, right? And so the first thing is to be compassionate with yourself, acknowledge how you're feeling, right? Recognize that that's okay and normal, and then reframe and say, like, maybe I'm wrong here. Maybe I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe I'm being unfair, right? I'm just upset right now. And then when you go in, something that I tell all my executives whenever they're having a difficult conversation with a peer or a staff member is to ask for consent. Say something like, "Would it be okay to share with you what I'm sensing?" Right? Or, "Could we have a conversation about, the incident that happened yesterday, so we can both, um, come to a solution about how to prevent something like that again," right? Keep that really solutions focused. Let them know that you're coming, you know, kind of as a peer, right? Like as a teammate, as an advocate, and not as an adversary. That's really important. What do you
Yeah,
think, Fergus?
no, I think it's really important because I think there are a few things. Like, I mean, one is don't don't you know don't make something more worse than it actually is. Just be careful because sometimes something small has happened and you've blown it completely out of proportion in your brain, and then you go and you want to talk to your peer or to a colleague about it, and you think it's far bigger, and they may not have even noticed it. What, I don't know, maybe they didn't hold the door open for you, whatever. So, like, I mean, whatever, and
Yeah.
you've overplayed it in your mind. So it's just, sometimes sometimes some of the things that you see, that's particularly important. The other thing too is just going in and saying, "Hey, coach," or "Hey," like, I just remember, I would say sometimes with senior coaches or head coaches, it would be, "Hey, coach, have you got a minute?" "Yeah, sure,
Hmm.
come in." And but not making out to be bigger than it, more important than it is, and really just getting to understand the people that you're working with, but recognizing that you will only ever have half of the puzzle. But it's more important to have the conversation than let something fester.
Hmm.
You can use, like you said, sometimes you don't get that opportunity to speak to the person, so you can use colleagues or a coach or someone to have conversations with. But you know I would be careful about how long you leave that until you actually get the opportunity just to speak to the person, find out what exactly they meant. And the first question always should be, "Hey, I was just wondering what you meant by," or rather
Yeah.
than saying, rather than taking up a position, find out what they meant by, rather than
Hmm.
taking up a position yourself first,
Yeah, and that
because
brings
you
up
might
a
never get out of it.
that's so true, and to you bring up a really good point of not making something bigger than it is. And so to clarify and rewind a little bit, when you're preparing to go into that meeting, or when you're considering going into that room and say, "Hey, coach, have you got a minute?" Or, "Hey, could I share something that I'm sensing?" Um, that self-compassion piece, right, where you're acknowledging how you feel, where you're asking yourself, "Is this normal?" Yeah. And then reframing a lot of the time, like I would say the majority of the time, they'll be like, actually, it's not that big of a deal." And you'll just decide you don't really actually care anymore. And it doesn't fester. And you're like, I'm sure they were fine. I'm sure it was just gonna let this one go. And when you let it go because of the fact that you don't actually care, you're not like don't care in the sense that you're not emotionally so charged up and angry about it anymore, and you're just giving them the benefit of the doubt. That's really cool because then you're creating this culture, this atmosphere of social safety, right? When you're able to give your client, your colleagues the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah, I think one thing that's really important is sometimes when things happen or you perceive things that maybe trigger a feeling of concern, sadness, or whatever it might be, being irritable. If you go through that process of just taking your time, looking at it, and the actual process itself of recognizing, okay, this is actually not that important. There's huge benefit in that because you're starting to help create a pattern that you can access anytime when small insignificant things happen, so you're not triggered by them. So there's a lot of benefit in doing it.
Yes,
I had
it
to do
makes
it
you
myself
much.
last week.
Did you? Yeah.
Oh yeah,
I
something was bugging me. And actually what it was really good because I had to sit there and go, this shouldn't be annoying you. Why is it annoying you? And able to place two or three things together and go, okay, and so those are the things. But it's recognizing it's really helpful for people to recognize there's a benefit to going through that process, because sometimes people just see it as a burden or as a trying, but there's a lot of benefit in actually taking that time to do it.
Yeah, it makes you more resilient, really.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Some things are important about getting annoyed. Some things are important enough to get annoyed about. So a lot of things are not.
Right. That's so true. And with that, should we move into tips?
Let's do it.
All right. So our tips for this week. Try to prioritize your self-awareness and allow for moments of self-reflection. Avoid the busyness trap and allow time and opportunity for communication to ensure that your perceptions are actually accurate, right? That you're reading things properly. And with that, consider the perspectives of others. Don't overplay, overthink, rush to judgment, and talk openly about it. And lastly, look for areas where you can demonstrate empathy, right? A lot of the times when we're really angry about something, it's because we're lacking some empathy for the other person. So once you calm yourself down, once you show yourself a little self-compassion, turn on the empathy for the other individual. Um, Fergus, anything else that I missed?
No, you've covered it.
Awesome. So, we're going to move on to coaching challenge then. Perfect. So this week, practice affirming your employees when you catch them doing something great and mindfully allow this to shift your opinion about them and what they're capable of. So often we walk into a situation with expectations about how someone's going to show up and ends up being a self-fulfilling prophecy. So instead, be looking for when they're doing what you really want them to be doing and how you really want them to be showing up. Affirm them for it and let it change your opinion of them within yourself. Okay? Any last words, Fergus?
No, I think that last one's particularly important because you want to so-called grease the groove. So if you're giving feedback, positive feedback, you're actually opening up that channel for somebody then to say, hey, Sarah, by the way, when you mentioned yesterday this, and this, did you mean? So just making sure that giving positive feedback allows other people to come to you with concerns or issues they have.
Yes. Absolutely. That's a great point to end on. So thank you, Fergus, and thank you everyone else for tuning in to this episode of Executives Uncut. And if you enjoyed this content, make sure to subscribe and share with someone who could benefit. We are everywhere. We're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Google Podcasts. I know I'm forgetting something. So you can find us pretty much everywhere. We are not on TikTok though. But you can find us pretty much everywhere. And you can also visit hodgescoaching.com for new episodes or follow us at Hodges Coaching on social media. I'm Sarah Hodges, and I'll see you next week.